And in terms of the geopolitics of the situation, another key player is Japan. Now, the right wing in South Korea has been largely not only pro-US, but also pro-Japan, which has outraged many people in South Korea because Japan is seen like Nazi Germany. Of course, Japan was an ally of Nazi Germany in World War II, and Japan colonized Korea and committed horrific crimes against humanity, just like the crimes committed by Nazi Germany. However, when Yoon Suk-yeol came into power, he tried to move closer to Japan and the US, and he even agreed to compensate victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. This was an absolutely crazy policy. I'm reading here from the BBC. It noted, South Korea has controversially agreed to pay compensation to its own citizens who were forced to work in Japanese factories during World War II. About 150,000 Koreans were forced to work in factories and mines by Japan in the war. They were enslaved, basically, by Japan during Japan's colonization of the Korean Peninsula from 1910 until 1945. For decades, activists in South Korea have demanded that Japan must pay South Koreans reparations because they were enslaved and exploited by Japan. So when Yoon Suk-yeol came in, what did he do? He said, we are going to pay our own citizens on behalf of Japan. I mean, this is an absolutely outrageous policy. And he said that we have to do this in order to improve our relations with Japan, the former colonizer. And of course, Japan is extremely unpopular among average people in South Korea. But the reason that Yoon wanted to do this is to appease his overlords in Washington and show how obedient he was to the United States. In fact, there was another shocking example of this in 2023 that shows how the right-wing pro-US forces in South Korea have been trying to rewrite the history of World War II and the crimes of the Japanese Empire. This was reported back in 2023 that the Korea Military Academy was trying to take down busts, that is statues, of heroes of the Korean independence movement erected on its campus and replace them with the bust of a general who served in the Manchukuo Imperial Army of Imperial Japan. And the reason that they were doing this is because of anti-communist hysteria, arguing that the Korean independence leaders who fought against the Japanese Empire were communists and socialists. I mean, many of them were. They were communists and socialists and leftists. So the right wing in South Korea is trying to erase all that history and trying to heroize the Japanese Empire allied with Nazi Germany that colonized Korea. And of course, they're also doing this to appease the United States. And meanwhile, while all this is happening, the South Korean regime under Yoon Suk-yeol has moved closer and closer to NATO, basically trying to integrate into NATO, which is hilarious because NATO is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And here you have South Korea on the other side of the world in the Pacific. But Seoul has been increasingly collaborating with NATO. And in fact, for the first time under Yoon, South Korea and also Japan have been participating in meetings of NATO defense ministers, which means that basically, like Ukraine has been unofficially made a member of NATO, South Korea and Japan are also being unofficially made members of NATO. And why does the United States want to integrate South Korea into NATO? Well, obviously to prepare for potential war on both China and North Korea. That's the serious danger here. And if you listen to comments from US military leaders, they're preparing for potential war. In April 2024, the head of US European Command, the US military general Christopher Cavoli, testified before the US Senate Armed Services Committee. And in those remarks, this top US military official coined a new term, what he called the axis of adversaries. And he said, what are the four countries in the so-called axis of adversaries? He named the People's Republic of China, Iran, Russia, and the DPRK, that is North Korea. And in August 2024, the New York Times reported that Joe Biden himself had approved a secret nuclear weapons strategy focused on the so-called Chinese threat. And the Biden administration ordered U.S. forces to prepare for possible coordinated nuclear confrontations with Russia, China, and North Korea. And back in 2023, the United States sent a nuclear-powered submarine to South Korea. At the time, this caused a lot of backlash inside South Korea. Many peace activists said, take it away. We don't want these nuclear submarines, because they're afraid that this could lead to a further arms race and further escalation. And what's scary is that as the U.S. pushes for more and more war, there are some people in the U.S. who are fine with that, and they're even fine with potential nuclear war. There was a shocking poll published in 2019 by the leading British polling firm YouGov, and it found that a third of people in the United States would support a preemptive nuclear strike on North Korea by the U.S., even if they knew it would kill 1 million innocent people. That is to say, a third of Americans are maniacs. They're willing to kill 1 million North Koreans in a nuclear war that the U.S. starts. They have no problem with that, according to this poll. That is truly shocking. And of course, the reason that they think this way is because they've been so brainwashed for decades by propaganda, which is ironic because, you know, we're so often told that North Korea is so brainwashed and everyone is so stupid there. Meanwhile, here we have people in the U.S., a third of them saying that they're willing to launch a nuclear war and kill 1 million people in North Korea. Who are the real brainwashed ones? But meanwhile, I should point out that the North Korean military budget is smaller than the budget of the New York Police Department. If the NYPD were an army, it would be the 20th best funded army on earth. It would spend more than the North Korean military. North Korea has nuclear weapons, and yet we're supposed to be so afraid. It's a deterrent. North Korea has made it clear they're not going to use nuclear weapons unless it's a matter of survival. They don't plan on attacking anyone. They haven't been involved in a war since the Korean War in the 1950s, in which the U.S. killed 20% of their population. Unfortunately, in the West, people know basically nothing about North Korea. They just say it's this crazy, evil state. But people know so little about Korean history that the Korean War in the 1950s is often referred to as the so-called Forgotten War. As the New York Times noted, between 3 million and 4 million Koreans were killed in this war, and as many as 70% of the dead were civilians. And the leading American historian of Korea, Bruce Cummings, said, quote, "North Korea was flattened. The North Koreans see the American bombing as a Holocaust." And it makes sense why they see the U.S. that way. This was discussed further in an interesting Washington Post article titled, "The U.S. War Crime North Korea Won't Forget." Now, it's full of a lot of propaganda, but there is some important information here. The Washington Post columnist pointed out that the hatred of the United States in North Korea is not all manufactured. Quote, "It is rooted in a fact-based narrative, one that North Korea obsessively remembers and the United States blithely forgets. The story dates to the early 1950s, when the U.S. Air Force, in response to the North Korean invasion that started the Korean War, bombed and napalmed cities, towns, and villages across the North." I'm still reading here from the article, quote, "The bombing was long, leisurely, and merciless, even by the assessment of America's own leaders. Quote, over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population," end quote. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command during the Korean War, told the Office of Air Force History. Dean Rusk, a supporter of the war and later U.S. Secretary of State, said the United States bombed everything that moved in North Korea, every brick standing on top of another. After running low on urban targets, US bombers destroyed hydroelectric and irrigation dams in the later stages of the war, flooding farmland and destroying crops. Although the ferocity of the bombing was criticized as racist and unjustified elsewhere in the world, it was never a big story back home, end quote. So this is why people in North Korea see the US in the way that a lot of people in the West see Nazi Germany. Because what the US did to the Korean people, killing off 20% of the entire North Korean population, is very similar to what Nazi Germany did inside Europe. But instead of recognizing that history and trying to look at things through the eyes of other people to understand their perspective, unfortunately, a lot of politicians in the West are doing the exact opposite. And not only in the United States, but also in Europe. So, for instance, the UK Defense Secretary said openly that he plans on the West being in a war not only with North Korea, but also being at war with Russia, China, and Iran. This was an absolutely insane article and video published by the British newspaper The Independent in January 2024. I'm reading here from the article, quote, Britain should prepare for further wars involving China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea in the next 5 years, Grant Shapps has warned. In his first speech as defense secretary, Shapps presented a dark picture of a, quote, pre-war world, end quote. So unfortunately, that's the very pessimistic note that I'm going to end on. Today I was talking about South Korea and how one of Washington's closest allies on earth tried to launch a military coup to dissolve democracy, and how the US has not said a single word of criticism because South Korea is militarily occupied by the US. The former US ambassador to South Korea referred to it as a client of the US empire, and the US wants South Korea to be a front line, a military tool, a pawn to wage a war not only against North Korea, but also against China. We are in a very, very dangerous situation in the world today, and there are so many crazy things happening. I mentioned the overthrow of the Syrian government, this coup attempt now in South Korea. Who knows what else will happen in the months and years to come? But we here at Geopolitical Economy Report will always be here analyzing and reporting on these important issues, helping people to understand what's going on. And I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will be back soon. See you all next time.